In Alaska, the single issue revolves around the size of the PFD check. And in the rest of the country, single issue voting revolves around the price of gas. And when we have that situation, we are so vulnerable to dominionist-minded politicians who are going to come in and say, I'm going to make the cost of gas cheaper, or I'm going to make sure you get the biggest PFD check possible. But then they're going to turn around and implement this dominionist agenda. And that's exactly what we have seen with Trump. He's promising cheap gas and then pulling the plug on all of these renewable projects. Dominionist politics are overwhelmingly funded with oil dollars. This money does not merely drive climate change, pollute the air that we breathe, and cause lifelong health problems that range from asthma to terminal cancer. It is funding school curricula that glorify the Confederacy and teach that the church must have dominion over society. And it is funding politicians who seek to enact those aims.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is author Keri Ladner, PhD. She is an expert on fundamentalist politics in America and the radicalization of the conservative movement. She specializes in the religious beliefs of the American right, and her work illuminates how those beliefs have become part of American power structures. She is here to discuss her new book, American Dominion, The Rise and Radicalization of New Christendom, which will be released this Thursday, April 16th. This is her second appearance on our podcast. Her first was 2 years ago after the publication of her book, In Time Politics, From the Moral Majority to QAnon. I'm dropping a link in the show notes to that episode, as well as other episodes that we've had on the topic of Christian nationalism and how fundamentalist Christianity has impacted Alaska politics. Keri Ladner, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So you're here today to talk about your new book, American Dominion, The Rise and Radicalization of New Christendom. Congratulations. It is just a fantastic book. This is your second appearance on the podcast. We had you for your last book, which was about Jerry Falwell. I guess, can you just talk a little bit about the genesis of this book and how it's different than your previous work?
Yeah, so with the book on Jerry Falwell, I was looking at the origins of the religious right and how so much of the political agenda was framed around this belief in prophecy about the end times and preparing America to face what Jerry Falwell believed was the end times, an imminent invasion by the Soviet Union and the rapture of all true Christians into heaven. But what's become pretty apparent in recent years is that we're seeing something very different happening in American politics, particularly within the religious right moving into American politics. You're not hearing talk about prophecy from the movers and shakers of the religious right. There's something that is much more dangerous that has come to the forefront. So when I started writing the book that became American Dominion, it was actually going to be a book about evangelical gun culture. And I started out by looking at the Columbine shooting in particular and the evangelical response to the Columbine shooting, especially with these stories that circulated that at least two of the students who died were asked at gunpoint if they believe in God. And these stories circulated that these students had died as martyrs. And so looking at how that shaped evangelical gun culture. And what I found in reading through all of this literature about the Columbine shooting is that one of the students who was mythologized as a martyr, Rachel Scott, her family was directly connected to these circles that were at the time, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, very heavily around the Colorado Springs, Denver area. Littleton, Colorado, which is where the Columbine shooting happened, is about an hour away from Colorado Springs. There's all of these evangelical ministries in Colorado Springs. You've got Navigators, Young Life, Biblica, Focus on the Family. And what I found is her family had these connections with this movement that was heavily involved in the Capitol riots. And specifically, they had connections to Dutch Sheets, who was a quote unquote apostle within this movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation. And Dutch Sheets was one of the primary organizers, if you will, of the Capitol riot. And so with that, I knew that I needed to look more into this movement around the New Apostolic Reformation. When I met the person who became my agent, what he told me is a book on gun violence is not going to sell, but make this about dominionism, make this about the New Apostolic Reformation and all of these other dominionist movements that are interconnected with it. And that's what I ended up doing. And that's where the book came from.
A Capitol riot, you mean January 6th?
Yes.
It's interesting to hear that origin story because Columbine is a part of the book. It's more in the middle of the book. And I found that part really interesting. And I think that's a topic I really want to talk about. Your book does a beautiful job of explaining all of these interrelated movements that have their own specific story. But in general, like especially today in 2026, I think that their interconnectedness is really the most important part, and the fact that they've kind of joined together to move what is, I guess, more generally the dominionist vision of, I was going to say Christianity, but then I was also going to say America. And I guess like that's the point.
So it is a little fuzzy. It's a vague vision. In broad terms, it says that Christians, or at least a certain kind of Christians, are to have dominion over all things, or that God has given Christians dominion over all things. So in one lane, Christians are to take dominion. In another lane, Christians already have dominion, and they just need to assert what God has already given them.
I'll just quote from the book on page 5 through 6. That a common goal of dominionism is, quote, to transform the American government as well as all nations of the world into the kingdom of God on earth. Dominionism is not one single ideology, but rather a collection of varying, sometimes competing belief systems. And then you kind of, in that same area, go on to talk about how things sort of melded together to bring forth Donald Trump's election.
Yes. So there are so many different movements, and you can definitely see them working in Alaska specifically. I know that David Barton and his Wall Builders organization has been present at quite a few churches in Alaska to present his particular version of American history. And what really amazes me is that some of these apostles and prophets who have mega churches with 20,000 plus people have gone to the Mat-Su Valley to speak to small groups of like 30, 40 people.
Interesting. Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think they are so interested in the Mat-Su Valley?
Well, for one, it's a very beautiful area. I mean,
it's a fun vacation trip, like a destination.
Right. I mean, if you had that opportunity to go take a working vacation to the Mat-Su Valley, why wouldn't you? But at the same time, if you look at a lot of what's been happening there, especially around things like public schools and funding cuts in general, it's starting to look to me like maybe this was a test case of what it could look like if dominionism begins to become public policy. And we see this in South Lake, Texas. So I live in the DFW area.
The Dallas-Fort Worth area.
South Lake is part of DFW. And a lot of the publicity around what happens when these guys take over a school board revolves around what happened in South Lake. There was a book that came out with an NBC News reporter, Mike Hixenbaugh, that looked specifically at the South Lake story. It's called They Came for the Schools. But it looks to me like the Mat-Su Valley, Mat-Su School District might have actually been a test case before that. And we can look at how the school board there attempted to ban American classics of The Great Gatsby and I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings back in 2020.
I want to point out that in your Jerry Falwell book, there was definitely an Alaska connection because of Jerry Prevost, who took over at Liberty University And so there's this sort of like direct pipeline from South Central Alaska to this movement in the lower 48. I will also remind listeners that 2 years ago had the new head preacher at what is called Mountain City Church now, what was called the Anchorage Baptist Temple, which is Jerry Prevo's church. So the man who took over for Jerry Prevo when Jerry Prevo left that church was on the podcast. That is just an overwhelmingly shocking episode, I think, for people to hear some of the things that he says so matter-of-factly. Like, for example, if you are a parent who is allowing your child to have free school lunch, shame on you. And this very much shaming of taking advantage of any sort of social program designed to help folks who have less income. And the fact that he does like a sort of yelling thing in his sermons where he's like shaming the audience if they're taking advantage of any social welfare programs.
Right. And it's just so appalling that he would point specifically to feeding children. Like, what is morally repugnant about making sure that kids have something to eat?
Hey, well, I'll just say what I said in the podcast. I just can't imagine Jesus saying what you're saying. And I mean, we have that discussion. But hey, back to you in this book. So you were talking about Columbine as sort of being a kernel for getting started. And
it was the launching pad for
as a
looking
launching
at something
pad.
bigger.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is they used Columbine, and by they, I mean folks as part of this dominionist movement, to talk about how this is the expected outcome when you take prayer out of schools, when you do not allow Bible reading in schools. And that really stems out of the two Supreme Court cases, Engel versus Vitale and Abington School District versus Shep, 1962 and 1963, that in some, that combined with what had happened a decade before, which was Brown versus the Board of Education, which integrated schools. So these, I would say, these three Supreme Court cases together basically were what evangelical Christians of the time were alarmed about, that their children were going to be secularized in some way, that parents were losing control of their children, and schools were taking the role of parents. And that, to me, in your book, that's kind of like they want to undo public schools because they see them as these indoctrination facilities, for lack of a better word.
And it's important to understand that the origin of dominionism, at least the modern dominionism that really took off with Rushdoony, with John Rushdoony, starting around the 1970s and 1980s, the origin of that is organizing against public schools. And we also see that with Jerry Falwell, and I wrote about that in End Time Politics. This stuff begins with attacks on public schools. And so if we want to look at what can we do to support our communities against these dominionist takeovers, the single most important thing that we can do is rally in support of our public schools.
I just want to mention R.J. Rushdoony lived from 1960 to 2001. He is, in some ways, extraordinarily radical and fringe. He advocated replacing the Constitution with the Bible. He wanted to replace the government with churches. He advocated the stoning of queer individuals. He advocated the stoning of children who dishonored their parents. And I think for most of his lifetime, I don't think anyone was really quoting him front and center. But I think what you do a good job of in your book is showing how his influence on the folks who were front and center was quite profound. And I think in one part of the book, you even mention that by him being so extreme, other folks could pull back a little bit from what he was saying and appear moderate.
Yes. And I think the example I used there was that if a Reconstructionism is the system that Rushdoony developed that says we are going to replace the Constitution with the Bible, and we're going to replace the federal government with local churches. The example I used was specifically looking at stoning queer people. And Rushdoony, he went on an interview with Bill Moyers, I think it's PBS, back in the 1980s, because this stuff actually had gained a lot of traction during the 1980s, and it had gained enough traction for Bill Moyers to be concerned and want to do a sit-down interview with Rushdoony. And Moyers asked him, "Do you want to stone people?" And Rushdoony responded, "I don't, but this is what the Bible says. This is what God says, and so it's what we have to do." And to look at this nature of extremist discourse, if Rushdoony or one of his acolytes is saying we need to stone queer people, and then somebody comes out and says, "No, what if we just put them in jail instead?" Well, now putting queer people in jail for being queer is in such a perverse way sounding like a good idea.
I think the example from the beginning of the book through the end of the book is current U.S. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Him writing and talking about the decriminalization of sodomy in Texas, I believe in 2003 or 2002.
Yes. That was in 2002, Lawrence v. Texas.
And Mike Johnson very publicly saying that this is a really, really, really bad step and that it should be reversed. I think you just do a great job of showing how entrenched Mike Johnson is in this movement. And I don't know if you can speak any to that at all, right?
I think it is important if we can just stay on this topic for a moment of this very extreme approach, this hatred of queer people. I think we do need to talk about what has happened in Uganda and the ways that so much of this anti-queer legislation in Uganda that does call for the death penalty, that legitimizes vigilante violence against queer individuals. So much of that was an import from American dominionists. It's like a test case for what would it look like for us to actually implement this as part of our national policy, and how can we make it work? How can we do it right?
I guess I had mistakenly felt that was an organic African movement to criminalize homosexuality and punish it with the death penalty. But what you do so well is show, no, that was really dominionist missionaries working in Africa and basically driving that government, in particular Uganda, toward that policy.
Yes, and the president of Uganda, he and his family are very interconnected with the dominionist movement, particularly with the New Apostolic Reformation.
I want to bounce back to schools and education and tie it into some of the philosophical underpinnings of the dominionist movement. And I may get some of this wrong and you can correct me, but in general, there's this idea that we have apostles living amongst us, and those are folks who are receiving messages directly from God. And they are basically the leaders, and they are honored and respected, and their word is most meaningful. And they are not scholars. Many of them did not go to seminary school. And in fact, you write at some point that seminary training can be frowned upon, and that there's something that's more real, more true about someone receiving their messages directly from God and not from a book. And that makes sense. Like when you profoundly believe that, of course, you're not that interested in your children excelling in a secular public school system when you don't need book learning, for lack of a better word. What you need is communion with God, or at least to be listening to someone in direct communion with God. And I think that is different than traditional religion, where people go to seminary and study the Bible as academics.
Yes. Well, let's be honest. A lot of seminaries are not focused primarily on academics. They are focused on the practical aspect, because so much of becoming a pastor and doing the work of a pastor is you're not spending 40 hours a week preparing a sermon. You are building up a community. You're connecting with people. You're supporting your congregation. You're supporting, outreaches within your local city. And so there's a lot of very practical aspects to ministry that people do gain in seminary. It's not just an academic pursuit. But what you're talking about, this idea of frowning upon the idea of traditional learning, it comes out of this very strong anti-intellectualism. And if you have somebody who has gone to seminary and they're looking at these sermons that apostles are preaching, they're going to have a few eyebrows raised and say, hey, this is heretical. I mean, what you're preaching, it might make for really good public speaking, but it's not biblical. And sure, you're using some Bible verses, you're pulling them all out of context, but there's a reason why these are not accepted teachings within the church. And then if we can pull that out into a larger context, that whole anti-intellectualism also feeds into, we don't want to be supporting public schools. And we can take the position of, we don't want for our kids to be learning evolution. We don't want for kids to be having to respect queer classmates. But then there's also that bigger and more historical picture that says the government is not supposed to have its hands in public education at all.
I'm thinking about Let Go and Let God and Whitall Smith's book, The Christian's Secret to a Happy Life from 1875. Mm-hmm. Because, and I'm quoting from your book, page 33 to 34, the idea contrasted sharply with the Puritan legacy of hard work and diligent study of the Bible. What many of her followers rejected were the church denominations, hierarchies, and theological minutiae that they saw as creating a formal, rigid Christianity that left the believer longing for joy. And I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about the importance of this let go and let God mentality that was started with her book, but then sort of pervaded the religion in such a way as even to like question the need for doctors or medical treatment, because really you just put everything in God's hands and it was God's will.
Yes, taking such a fatalistic approach. And to be clear, I don't think that that is what Hannah Whitall Smith intended to happen with her book. I don't think she planned for her book to become part of the seed that would become the MAGA movement. I think she was genuinely concerned about, let's take Christianity away from this focus on dogma and rituals and things that don't necessarily feed the inner lives of people and serve their communities. And let's focus on the more practical aspects. And that is what has been so powerful about the Pentecostal movement, which is what I look at a lot in American Dominion, where we have this brand of Pentecostalism that was dominionist. There is such power in this idea that you don't need to go to seminary. You don't need to go through a pastor or a priest in order to experience a connection with God, that you can have this joy in your daily life. This is just a revolutionary concept. And we can look at how there's, these positive components of that idea. But I remember growing up in a Southern Baptist church. Southern Baptist is not Pentecostal, okay? But it constantly hearing let go and let God. That's not in the Bible. And what did it even mean? It's like this catch-all phrase that you can just throw at people. Stop worrying, don't take these necessary steps that you need to take. In extreme cases, yes. And so Chris Valentin, who is the prophet of Bethel Church in Redding, California, he and his fellow apostle, Bill Johnson, have spent time in the Matsu Valley speaking to small groups of people, which just raises eyebrows for me. He has a book called The Supernatural Ways of Royalty. And in it, he shares a story of one of their assistants at the church who was diagnosed with cancer. And she refused to seek out medical treatment because she was convinced that God would miraculously heal her cancer. And this is that example of let go and let God, like this extreme example that says, don't do the things that you're told that you're supposed to do to get the desired outcome. Don't go to the doctor when you have a cancer diagnosis. And this woman died. But somehow in the book, Chris Valentin turns that around and says, she's a hero to me because she chose to die in faith rather than live in fear. And, that's so bizarre. And it's just so dangerous because, there's parents who could have still had their child, and there's children who could have still had their mom, and there's brothers and sisters who could have still had their sister with them. And the fact that he's encouraging people to die of cancer and trust God instead of trusting in medical authorities, I cannot overstate how profoundly dangerous that is, especially when this author is someone who becomes as profoundly influential as he has.
In your preface, you talk about Olive Heilingenthal. Is that how you say her last
Mm-hmm.
name? And she died at age 2, and that we're talking about Bethel Church in Reading. Her parents are members there, and the church does the 5 days of prayer to raise Olive back to life. And, calling on people around the world to join in praying for Olive. And I think that really speaks to this movement and saying that miracles are not something from the ancient past. Miracles are possible today. You just have to believe hard enough. Can you speak a little bit about that particular case and how you decided to use that to sort of bookend the book?
Yeah. So I want to be clear that it was a bit of a difficult choice to decide to use this example because this was a very severe tragedy. A 2-year-old died suddenly. And her parents, Andrew and Callie, they were worship leaders at Bethel Church. And instead of going through the process of planning a funeral, they followed the church's teachings, which that's exactly what they did. They followed the church's teachings and said, instead of burying our child, we are going to bring her back to life. So Bethel has this ministry school that it operates. It's an alternative to seminaries. So seminaries have traditional, established theological and practical training. And the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry does not. What it has, it's basically teaching students a tried and true, quote unquote, tried and true methodology for how to perform miracles and become these miracle working revivalists in their everyday lives. And that is just at the core of everything that Bethel is, that the idea that they have an apostle who serves as a funnel from heaven. His name is Bill Johnson. He is one of the best-selling authors in the world, one of the most influential people that you might have never heard of. He supposedly receives divine revelation from God, as well as access to supernatural blessings for ensuring that these miracles are going to happen. And if you can submit yourself appropriately to your apostle, in this case to Bill Johnson, and have enough faith and follow this methodology that they have laid out, then the miracle is supposed to come naturally. With the Wake Up Olive case, this happened in front of the eyes of the world, and the miracle did not happen. There were articles in the Washington Post, I think the New York Times, writing about what was happening at Bethel Church in December of 2019, and just what seemed to be such a bizarre instance of, this is not a small cult of 20 people, but this is a mega church, 20,000 people in the congregation. Their music is played at churches all over the world, books and conferences all over the world. And they're spending 5 days trying to resurrect a 2-year-old who died. And what this really speaks to me about, I didn't get into this in the introduction, but what really stands out about this is the way that the apostle and prophet respond to tragedy versus the way that a seminary trained pastor would respond to tragedy. This idea of, oh, we're going to resurrect your child. You don't need to worry about planning a funeral. And I just can't imagine how much worse the heartache is after that, as opposed to somebody who is trained and has the experience and the maturity to provide pastoral care to a family that is grieving this kind of loss.
Well, one of my epiphanies about this movement, and we just talked about it a little bit when talking about let go and let God, and this moving away from formal, rigid Christianity towards something more joyful. And the speaking in tongues, glossolalia, the ecstatic utterances that
Glossolalia.
glossolalia, thank you. The
Yeah,
glossolalia,
there's your $5 word for the day.
glossolalia that I think in some ways is sort of the stereotype of the Pentecostal movement, and also what people have seen on TV of people walking up and the minister placing his hand and the person falling down. There's this ecstatic joy in the congregation, and miracles are happening, and that's such in contrast to sort of the tra- traditional idea of a boring church service from the
Yes.
1800s.
Yes. I
And
mean, if you can compare a pastor or an apostle who's claiming to speak the very words of God, and he's got these really dynamic musicians that are playing music that they wrote, and that is winning the Dove Award, and compare that to a hellfire and brimstone preacher who insists on wearing a three-piece suit every day, who are you going to listen to? It's not even a question. This is so much more appealing.
something else that you talk about in the book is with this movement away from traditional denominations and traditional hierarchies within a church, and also really away from any sort of like democratic, the apostle is sort of revealed. They're not voted on. They're not decided upon by a majority opinion. It's an authoritarian way of organizing yourself. And there's real danger in that. And there's real danger in the loss of accountability of a more traditional denomination. Speaking of abuse happening, throughout the book, it talks about like some of these leaders who are later found to be guilty of sexual abuse of children and young people. And then some ways being excused for that. And I can't help but think about that in your section talking about the Duggars and the disciplining of children and the harsh disciplining, and To Train Up a Child by Michael and Debbie Pearl, teaching parents how to spank their children as severely as possible without getting reported to children's services.
Yeah. So what is so significant and where we see a direct translation into the world of Donald Trump is this idea that a leader is called by God and not accountable to the people. If you look at the policies of Bethel Church, there is no way to remove Bill Johnson from leadership. The congregation cannot vote him out. The board cannot vote him out. He has veto power over his own board. So he cannot be removed from leadership. And if you don't like what he teaches, your only option is to leave. But then you're just caught in this catch-22 where, well, if I'm no longer submitting to my apostle, then I'm not going to receive these blessings from God. I'm no longer going to receive this revelation from God that my apostle promises me. So you create this environment where the spiritual abuse serves as a prelude to the sexual abuse that occurs so incredibly often within these circles. In the time since I finished writing the manuscript for American Dominion, there's a massive abuse scandal that's come out of Bethel Church, where one of the quote unquote prophets that they would bring in, professing to speak the very words of God, he was a serial offender and constantly abusing women at the church. And the leadership knew about this, and they let him keep coming in because of his supposed prophetic ability. And so they're intentionally not protecting the young women in their church and actually giving a prophet or a self-proclaimed prophet access to them. And then there was another instance where there's a book by Danny Silk. He talks about how one of their ministry pastors at the ministry school had an affair with somebody outside of his own marriage, and he had to confess it and was restored. Danny Silk talked about it in this book like it's this amazing story of God's restoration. The book is called Unpunishable, and how this guy, even though he had an affair outside of marriage, God's love had made him unpunishable, and this is such a wonderful feel-good story. What Danny Silk did not say, but knew, was that he did not have an affair. He assaulted his live-in nanny. And this was not a feel-good story deserving of somebody's recognition of God's mercy. This was a criminal case that needed to be prosecuted, but it all gets covered up with this idea that these prophetically, apostolically gifted individuals are divinely called by God, and nobody can speak a word against them. And we see this directly happening with the Trump administration, where he's seen as being called directly by God. He is accountable to no one. He can do whatever he wants.
Right.
And like, I mean, just not even an afterthought. We know that he's an abuser. He's been convicted.
And so I think that explains so much. And can you go to the book? Can you go to page 143? I'm actually going to have you read a couple of paragraphs. And this is David Barton. Barton regularly depicts the cosmic struggle between secular humanism and Christianity in mundane terms, Democrats versus Republicans.
Barton regularly depicts the cosmic struggle between secular humanism and Christianity in mundane terms, Democrats versus Republicans. The GOP has been the party of choice for America's Christian nationalists ever since the religious right burst into public life in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As thought leaders like Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye shaped nationalist discourse among evangelicals, they demonized the Democratic Party literally. Women's liberation, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement were all satanically inspired, as were the welfare programs that Democrats tended to champion and Republicans tended to malign. Barton's portrayal of American history as a perpetual struggle between God-fearing Republicans and God-hating Democrats makes his historical analysis so asinine that no mainstream historian has taken it seriously. But it has fallen on welcome ears. Millions of conservative evangelicals who have been on the receiving end of this kind of partisan rhetoric since the 1970s eagerly anticipate scholarship that casts American politics in terms of a cosmic war between good and evil. Among this audience, Barton has a voice so profound that he is a New York Times bestselling author.
I just can't tell you how important it is for me to read that because, as a Democratic legislator in Alaska, there's just so much public testimony, so many people who are so angry about Democrats. And it has nothing to do with our views or the bills that we're promoting or the stances that we're taking. And it's so hard to explain if you try to somehow figure out the reason why they're so angry at me. It's because they believe that Democrats hate God and that if I'm somehow accidentally supporting their position on this issue, that it must be some kind of trick. And the thing is, they have been indoctrinated in this sort of rhetoric for over 50 years. Like it is part of the air they breathe.
Yes. And especially when you do have pastors like the one who took over for Jerry Prevost, insisting that shame on you for having your kids get free lunch at school. Shame on you for wanting your children to eat, even if your paycheck is not what it needs to be.
If you go to page 66, talking about Lance Wallnau, democracy is no longer necessary because America is ruled by King Jesus through governing apostles, starting with Sarah Palin, Rick Perry, and moving on to Donald Trump. The 7 Mountain Mandate is not about engaging democracy, as was Falwell's idea when he organized the religious right in the late 1970s and 1980s. The 7MM is about ending democracy. And I think that is something that for folks who are like, what is happening in America today? Like, how is it possible that our country elected someone who seems to be purposely trying to make government not work? Like, how did this happen and why? I think you're explaining it here. Can you explain what the 7 Mountain Mandate is?
Sure. The 7 Mountain Mandate is this belief among the apostles and prophets and individuals who subscribe to them within the New Apostolic Reformation, the belief that there are seven mountains of culture. They include family, the arts, media, education, business, economics. There's seven of them, and that God has called on Christians to take control of each of the seven mountains. And the idea is an extension of this idea of apostles leading the church, where you have an apostle at the top of each of the mountains who is, again, serving as this supernatural funnel from God to receive God's divine wisdom as well as supernatural blessings to release onto those who submit to them. And just like with the apostles who preside over churches and have no seminary training, an apostle on top of these other mountains does not need to be an expert in the field. You don't have to be somebody who has studied education and worked in the field of education for decades in order to be an apostle over the mountain of education and be making decisions that are going to affect millions of children every single day. You just have to be supernaturally called by God. And that is what is so incredibly terrifying. But that also does help us understand why so many people are finding it acceptable for Trump to be placing people with absolutely no experience and who are actually trying to dismantle their own departments on top of each of his bureaucracies.
You talked about Kevin Roberts, who's president of the Heritage Foundation, and he wrote a book that came out before Project 2025, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. I'm just going to read one sentence. Quote, "For America to flourish again, our institutions don't need to be reformed. They need to be burned." And then he has a long list of the institutions that he thinks need to be burned down, including every Ivy League college, the FBI, the New York Times, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the Department of Education, and the list goes on.
And we have seen Trump taking aim at all of them.
Yes, yes. And you say specifically about Project 2025. Project 2025 was not about violently overthrowing the government. It was about subverting it from within so that the seven mountain mandate could be fulfilled. Not just on the mountain of government, but in every area of society, education, media, religion, the arts and entertainment. I just want to point out for the arts and entertainment, every time I read that, I was like, it is now the Trump Kennedy Center. Like, putting his name on like this institution of art and culture in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to clarify here that Roberts does not necessarily subscribe to the Seven Mountain Mandate. Neither does J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance wrote the preface to this book, and it was originally called Dawn's Early Light, Burning Down Washington to Save America. So they don't necessarily subscribe specifically to the Seven Mountain Mandate, but they have their own understanding of government, and they work with the Heritage Foundation, where there is just a perfect dovetail with the Seven Mountain Mandate. So among the American public, especially among conservative evangelicals who have come to embrace these ideas of dominionism, and maybe they don't even realize that they've been embracing dominionism. What they've really embraced is these really catchy worship songs that are played on the radio. Really catchy. I mean, and award-winning. I've heard Beatles music played at Panera Bread. Okay? But this dominion theology is just flowing in through all of it. And they are accepting the Seven Mountain Mandate, maybe not realizing just how extreme and how dangerous it is. But it sounds like a good idea that Christians should be having this level of control over society. And so you have the population at large, at least a significant portion of the population, is very much sympathetic to at least a toned down version of the Seven Mountain Mandate, if not a full-blown version of the Seven Mountain Mandate. Whereas you have with Kevin Roberts and J.D. Vance, this integralist vision of Catholicism that wants to see church and state completely reunified.
Another thing that you explained in a way that I think provides clarity where there was none is on Trump's loss in 2020. And you talk about Jeremiah Johnson, who was on Pat Robertson's show on the Christian Broadcast Network. I'm going to read from your book. Johnson refused to recant his prophecy. and instead doubled down on it because he prophesied that Trump was going to win that election, saying on Robertson's show, quote, either a lying spirit, a demon, has filled the mouths of numerous trusted prophetic voices in America, or Donald Trump really has won the presidency. And we are witnessing a diabolical and evil plan unfold to steal the election, end quote. In other words, the numerous prophecies themselves were the evidence that Trump had truly won the 2020 election. And that makes so much sense because it's like all these people were convinced that this must be true. God has ordained it. And therefore, all we have to do is find the evidence because we know it must be rigged. We know it in our hearts it must be rigged. And I think that is the best explanation because there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. The bottom line was Trump lost the 2020 election, but they couldn't accept it.
Right. And it's just astounding to me that this, the president who was supposed to clean the swamp, if massive voter fraud happened, how did it happen on his watch if he had supposedly been cleaning out the swamp?
Hey, as we get towards the end of our time, the end of your book, can we go to page 228? Because you actually do offer some advice about what the country can do to start remedying some of this nightmare.
Okay. If we are to do anything about this radicalized movement that has overwhelmed our political institutions, we need to get to where the funding is. Dominionist politics are overwhelmingly funded with oil dollars. This money does not merely drive climate change, pollute the air that we breathe, and cause lifelong health problems that range from asthma to terminal cancer. It is funding school curricula that glorify the Confederacy and teach that the church must have dominion over society. And it is funding politicians who seek to enact those aims. This may sound underwhelming, but part of the way back begins with renewable energy.
And I think that's so important for an Alaskan politician to hear, because if there was ever a state that is governed by oil, it is Alaska. And I think for me, if I hear something over and over and over and over again, it begins to feel true, even though intellectually I know it's not. And that is, in our state, we are told over and over and over again that we need to allow more drilling, more fossil fuels, de-emphasis on renewables. Trump has pulled funding on green, he calls it, like, I think he calls it the green scam or
the green new scam. Yeah.
Just pulling federal funding on projects that had already been greenlit and
that were almost finished.
Yes. And the thing is that I'm supposed to somehow accept this as being okay. And in the end, in the best interest of Alaska, it is not. We have villages falling into the water. We are on the front lines of climate change. And the idea that somehow we need to cut taxes on oil companies, allow them to make even greater profits so that they can invest more money in dismantling our country, it's absurd.
Right. And I think we need to recognize here that most Americans are single issue voters. And the single issue that we vote on is not abortion. The single issue that we vote on is gas. In Alaska, the single issue revolves around the size of the PFD check. And in the rest of the country, single issue voting revolves around the price of gas. And when we have that situation, we are so vulnerable to dominionist-minded politicians who are going to come in and say, I'm going to make the cost of gas cheaper, or I'm going to make sure you get the biggest PFD check possible. But then they're going to turn around and implement this dominionist agenda. And that's exactly what we have seen with Trump. He was promising that we're going to have cheap gas again. I drive an electric car, so I don't have to worry about it. Well, the cost of everything goes up, but he's promising cheap gas and then pulling the plug on all of these renewable projects, including projects that are already almost completely finished and ready to come online, dismantling all regulations around climate change and air pollution. And now in this present moment, gas prices are the highest that they've ever been because he started a war in another country. But he has been led so much by this dominionist agenda.
Two things I want to end with. Number one, In the quote I just had you read, you said that glorify the Confederacy. And we really didn't talk about racial politics today, but they are front and center. We did not talk about British Israeli. How do you say it?
British Israelism.
Yes, about the idea that the chosen people are white Anglo-Saxon people. And, it's in the book, it talks about how the Confederacy was truly godly. The North was humanistic and anti-God, and that somehow it was a war between God lovers and God haters. It had nothing to do with slavery. I mean, that's all in your book.
Clarify for a
Yeah,
second. This is an interpretation of the Civil War.
correct.
That is not by any stretch how I would frame the Civil War. It was 1,000% over slavery.
Correct. But am I not wrong that David Barton, in his massive influence on textbooks in Texas, has actually reframed the way the textbooks talk about the Civil War and talk about slavery?
He's definitely reframed how we talk about the Ku Klux Klan. And I know that we have to end, but I think it is just so important to talk about the Klan because this branch of Pentecostalism that became the seed of today's MAGA movement was intimately connected with the Klan. So in the late 1800s, the platforms of the Democratic and the Republican Party were maybe not the exact opposite, but they were the opposite. The parties flipped in the 1960s. But the Ku Klux Klan, when it first came to power in the 1860s, was comprised of Democrats in large number, returning Confederate soldiers who were facing economic devastation, and they had a gun, and they hated Black people. And they formed this invisible empire that just terrorized freed slaves throughout the South. The way that David Barton has framed it is that the Klan was a problem of political violence against Republicans, and he holds that is a direct carryover into today, completely ignoring, 150, 160 years of history, including the fact that the platforms of the Democratic and the Republican parties have switched since then. And this just goes back to what I read earlier about how this cosmic struggle, what he and other dominionists have viewed as a cosmic struggle between quote unquote secular humanism and Christianity, it's really Democrat versus Republican.
Hey, and last thing I want to end on, I cannot not ask you about it since you're here. You mentioned the war in Iran, and Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, he is speaking about Christianity all the time and doing these very violent prayers. And I just don't know if you can place him in this movement in any way or not.
He has definitely been influenced by this movement, including by Doug Wilson, who is a pastor in Idaho, who it does look like he has a lot of influence coming in from the Aryan nations, which is also based in Idaho, or was. I don't think that they exist anymore. But we can look and see how his ideas that he's talking about with like spiritual violence and spiritual warfare, how he has this very literalized approach. And that is a product of this brand of Pentecostalism, particularly this revival movement in the 1940s, 1950s called the Latter Rain Revival, where they developed this very literal approach, this belief that prayer and worship are actually attacks on our enemies. And he takes that very literally.
Keri Ladner, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It was great to be here.
It's an honor. What date does this book come out?
The official release is Thursday the 16th.
Thursday, April 16th. It is a tremendously important book. I cannot be more grateful that I read it in the middle of session because it explains so much about what's happening in Alaska politics, even though the book is not directly about Alaska. Again, thank you so much and congratulations.
Hey, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklug.gov or call 907-465-4940.